Hey, happy Thursday morning, everyone. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and I appreciate you being with me. Hope you've had a great week so far. I don't know about you, but this week has flown by. Wow. It seems like Monday. Some of you will understand that. Anyway, we are looking at the doctrine of the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15. We are doing that through the prism of the doctrine of the new heaven and the new earth. Now, in order to do that, I've been sharing with you some thoughts from the Old Testament prophecies of the new heaven and the new earth. Now, here's something that's just as plain, just as simple, something as easy to understand as possible. Okay? That is, the coming of the Lord is the time of the resurrection. The coming of the Lord is the time of the new heaven and the new earth. Resurrection, coming of the Lord are absolutely inextricably bound. Just simply no denying that, in the new covenant especially. Now, I've been sharing some thoughts with you on Isaiah chapter 66 of how God predicted he was going to come in flaming fire to destroy his enemies and bring in the new heaven and new earth. I've shared with you how that is set directly in the context of the judgment of the temple and of Jerusalem. Old covenant temple would be destroyed. God's everlasting, eternal, spiritual temple would be set in place. Not a literal, visible, physical, temple, but a spiritual temple. Now, I want you to notice something very quickly. Keep in mind that in 2 Peter chapter 3, I'm going to read verses 1 and 2. Beloved, I now write to you this second epistle, in both of which I stir up your pure minds by way of reminder. So Peter says, this is the second time I've written to you about the same subject. We have 1 Peter. Now watch. That you may be mindful of the words which were spoken before by the holy prophets, and the commandment of us, the apostles of the Lord. So what's Peter doing? Peter is saying, I'm reminding you of what the Old Covenant prophets said. It's absolutely amazing to me that some people try to avoid the force of this term, holy prophets. And they say, oh, Peter's not talking about the Old Covenant prophets. And you see, the reason they do that is because they know if Peter's talking about the Old Covenant prophets, then what he's talking about in 2 Peter chapter 3 were promises made to Old Covenant Israel. And if they're promises made to Old Covenant Israel, then unless and until God's promises to Old Covenant Israel are fulfilled, then God's covenant with Israel remains valid and intact. That's what that means. So they try to avoid this. David Hester, in preparation for our very first formal debate, denied that Peter was referring to Old Covenant prophets here. Sorry, that won't work. It is simply specious and untenable. So here is Peter reminding them of what the Old Covenant prophets said about the day of the Lord's coming in flaming fire, the Lord's coming to bring in the new heaven and the new earth. So keep that in mind, verses 1 and 2. Now look at verse 10. But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise. The elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up. Therefore, since all of these things will be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in all holy conduct and godliness, looking for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be dissolved, being on fire, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Nevertheless, we, according to his promise. What promise? Well, I'm writing this second epistle to you to remind you of what the Old Covenant prophets said. According to the promise, we look for new heavens, new earth. Okay? What Old Testament prophet spoke of the coming of the new heaven and new earth? Isaiah 65, Isaiah 66. But wait a minute. Hey, look, I was raised believing very fervently, very passionately, that 2 Peter 3 is talking about the end of time. The earth, the literal physical earth, being totally burnt up. And then I began to actually study for myself. And I began to realize that the language that Peter is using is apocalyptic, metaphoric language. Don't forget, 14-lesson MP3 series on defining the day of the Lord. $17.95 total cost. Now, here's the argument that I want you to catch. Boy, you really have to catch the power of this. Here is Peter in 2 Peter chapter 3, referring to the Old Covenant prophets of the day of the Lord in flaming fire to bring in the new heaven and new earth. Isaiah 65 and Isaiah 66 predicted the coming of the Lord in flaming fire to bring in the new heaven and the new earth. Wait a minute. Hang on. Catch this. What was to be the nature of the day of the Lord in flaming fire to bring in the new heaven and the new earth? Well, go back to Isaiah 64 again. Oh, that you would rend the heavens. Oh, that you would come down, that the mountains might melt at your presence as fire burns the brushwood. Lord, when you did awesome things, you came down. The mountains melted at your presence. Remember, Isaiah, in his prediction of the day of the Lord in flaming fire to bring in the new heaven and new earth, would be a day of the Lord like previous days of the Lord. None of those had been a literal, visible, bodily coming of God out of heaven. Peter, in 2 Peter chapter 3, is anticipating the coming of the Lord in flaming fire to bring in the new heaven and the new earth according to the promise of the Old Testament. In fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies of the coming of the Lord in flaming fire to bring in the new creation. So if Peter was anticipating the fulfillment of the Old Covenant prophecies of the day of the Lord in flaming fire to bring in the new heaven and new earth, and he was. But if the Old Testament prophecies of the day of the Lord to bring in the new heaven and new earth were predictions of the day of the Lord like previous days of the Lord, and if the previous days of the Lord were never, ever, ever literal, visible, bodily comings of the Lord out of heaven on a literal cloud, then it must be true that here in 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter was not anticipating, Peter was not predicting a literal, visible, bodily coming of the Lord out of heaven in flaming fire to destroy the earth and to raise physical bodies out of the grave to bring in the new heaven and the new earth. Once again, 14-lesson MP3 series defining the day of the Lord. $17.95 total cost, postpaid. And next week, I'm going to make you a great 1-month special. A great 1-month special on that MP3 series and my book, The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat. Kind of look forward to that, okay? If you've already got my book, The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat, you will definitely want this 14-lesson MP3 series. You can order it alone, but I'm going to make you a fantastic deal on just the MP3 series and my book, The Elements Shall Melt. You'll be looking for that. In the meantime, don't forget, tomorrow I will continue our examination, review, and refutation of Joel Richardson's book, Mystery Babylon. You don't want to miss that. We will see you on the flip side.